Hey, TRP crew, we all know the importance of mindset, and so I've put together a webinar that matters for you to listen to because it really focuses on mindset as it relates to care planning. Let's start that webinar now. Hey, thanks so much for joining me. My name is Dr. David Fletcher. I'm the CEO and founder of CLA. And one of the things I love to do is discuss neuroplastic care planning. So today's topic is really about transforming your care plans with the knowledge and the use of neuroplasticity. You know, neuroplasticity is one of the hottest topics these days in the neurosciences, and there's a reason for that. Neuroplasticity really is what we chiropractors could call hope. Why? Because the old paradigm of neurology used to say, once it's been lost, you never get it back. But the truth is that the neurosciences have come to realize that the nervous system is very plastic, it's very adaptable. And what better word to describe outcomes that chiropractors are looking for than adaptability? So today what I'd like to do is just describe to you some of the important ideas that we have, especially through the lens of looking at objective data and how we can use objective data from digital examination systems like the Insight scanning technologies so that we can have confidence when we build care plans to know that we're actually making the changes that we're desiring, not only in how a patient feels, but how they are functioning. So the first thing I'd like to really put a focus on is the adaptable nervous system. Our genomes, the thing that runs our DNA, is actually the success story of gazillions of adaptable relationships that we've had. For us to be able to understand our environment and adapt to it, we have to rely upon the wisdom of the body that's built into each and every one of us. And that wise response has to be transmitted through an unobstructed nervous system. This is one of the reasons that chiropractic is so powerful for initiating neuroplastic change. Why? Because embedded patterns of distortion, which we refer to as the subluxations, can really interfere with the communication and create noise in the nervous system. This noise becomes a new habit, and this new habit slows down and interferes with the performance of the entire nervous system. Well, before we know it, we have a number of these habits destroying the performance and interrupting the expression of the health of that patient. In fact, one of the things that we know is that those old habits become so ingrained that they become the new normal for our patients. So patients who come to see us many times have this idea that they are locked and trapped in something that cannot change. Sure, they have symptoms, but when we ask them a little bit deeper about what's really going on in their health, they have this long story about how they've had a declining amount of energy, that they don't sleep as well, they don't think as clearly as they'd like to. In fact, they really start to realize that they're not the person they'd like to be. And this is where we can start to invoke or start to decide how neuroplasticity can be our ally when we're building a care plan. So one of the things that we need to do is have a confidence in what we're doing to change this. And what I want to share with you is that looking at Insight scans can give you the gateway to that change. In fact, it can become your roadmap for changing the health and the neurology of each and every one of your patients. So there are some basic constructs in neuroplasticity that we need to focus on. I'm going to keep this really simple. Neuroplasticity can be understood in two simple words: time and repetition. One of the things that was learned as the neuroplastic modeling came about was that if you did positive change over time, that the brain would literally rewire itself. There's an old saying that says, neurons that fire together rewire together. Well, here's what we know, is that the nervous system is constantly learning. In fact, I want you to remember this: the nervous system never stops learning. So it's learning to process good or bad information and building pathways right through the brain and down into the body based on that information that's coming forward. And so if we, in sort of the good old terminology, if we have garbage in, we get garbage out. But what if we got good in and we found out we could get good out? And that's the joy and that's the basis of neuroplasticity. But the reality is that one approach, which simply opens up the door, doesn't mean that it actually makes the change. We have to add repetition to it. So I want to share with you that if time and repetition are the basis of neuroplasticity, then the next thing we want to do is we want to have tools that track that changeability. And most importantly, we want to establish that there is a new trend. And you can't do that by saying, "How are you?" You have to test and not guess. And that has been the foundational element behind everything we do at CLA. In other words, what we do when we built the insight scanning technologies and why we stand at the forefront of making neuroplastic care planning a priority is that we understand that it's so important to be able to interpret those neurofunctional signals that are going through and that we're measuring with insight scanning and watch for changeability and then for trends. But here's the other side of it. Remember I said earlier, the nervous system never stops learning? When you begin to understand neuroplasticity and the fact that the nervous system is always ready to adapt, you never want to offer care plans that have an endpoint. You always want to be able to offer with confidence and certainty, as neuroscientists that you are, that there is value in having patients come and be checked and cared for the rest of their lives. So what we want to do is we want to tell you how to support neuroplastic care planning by understanding how to interpret and use the insight scanning technologies. Well, we made it really easy because although there are diverse data sets that are coming from heart rate variability, which gives us the idea of adaptability and resilience, we add to that the exhaustion that happens when there is postural loading and expenditure of postural energy by understanding the EMG signals. And we tie it all together by looking deeper into the actual spinal nerves that are regulating the control of temperature, organs, and glands. We tie that data all together to create a really simplified model of understanding called the CORE score. Now, the CORE score is a really brilliant approach that actually tracks neuroplasticity. Why? Because the CORE score is seen as a neural efficiency index. Just imagine that we have an index of 100 that actually talks about a 100% efficient nervous system. And a 100% efficient nervous system is primed and ready to be neuroplastically responsive. What if when we scan our patients initially and we find that they have a 50 or 60% efficiency or a 50 or 60 score on their CORE score? Well, what happens if that CORE score goes up by, say, 5 points and they feel better? They may think that chiropractic has come and gone. And in that care planning model, they would be left with a deficit in how they would express their health and express their life, possibly for the rest of their lives. Now that you have that objective data, you can start to have conversations with them, but have the confidence to build beyond their symptoms and talk about the value and the way in which you can track and manage their care every step of the way. How does that work? Well, the CORE score has built into it 4 progressions in which we can communicate that neuroplastic advantage. The first one is an initial CORE score, and what that means is that we can begin to say, our first goal in neuroplastic care plan is to actually watch and see if your nervous system is accepting change and is changeable. You know, one of the challenges that happens in care planning is that many times it falls back to old models. You know what those old models are? They're based on physiotherapeutic outcomes. They typically focus on relief, correction, and maintenance. Now, I don't know if you know this, but maintenance is not a chiropractic word for outcomes. In fact, maintenance isn't anything that the nervous system strives to do. It actually is trying not to maintain and become static. It's constantly learning. What if we replace the goals of care planning in a neuroplastic model to think about release, reorganization, and revitalization, to actually remove that old model and replace it with a neuroplastic one? Well, the CORE score does just that. It allows us to look at if the system is releasing and able to accept the changes that a chiropractor is placing into the spine and nervous system. After that, the focus becomes trending. And so we look at progress exams and comparative exams to compare the data to see if there are new trends that are emerging, which are more efficient. And all the time that this new changeability and this new ability to identify trends is going on, the core score is increasing. So learning how to use scanning technologies to build care plans, to have the confidence as the clinician, and to ensure that you have all the data you have to recommend care that goes perhaps not only for 12 visits, but for 12 weeks, for 12 months and beyond. Now you know that you aren't making this up, that you are tracking the data that is right directly in front of you that was generated from their nervous system. So neuroplasticity really is a journey, and you need the signposts along that journey to make it come alive. Thanks for listening in. I've talked a lot about care planning and neuroplasticity, and if you like what you've heard, we have an ebook on this exact topic. And if you would like more information or to talk to one of our Insight advisors, we're ready to answer your questions so that you have the confidence to look further and deeper into what it is to have an insight in your office.